Next, and our last speaker is Emilie Tumale. She is a PhD candidate in sociology of education at NYU Steinhardt. Her research interests are at the nexus of Asian American studies and higher education, as she is particularly interested in further understanding the experiences of Filipino American college students and how they conceptualize the ethnic identity as New Yorkers, their ethnic identity as New Yorkers, Before attending NYU, she received her MA in Asian American Studies from UCLA, where she taught courses on the Asian American movement and the history of Asian Americans. Emilie also received her BA in Asian American Studies, Filipino Studies concentration with a minor in education at UCLA. The talk is titled, "But We're Not Viewed as Asian, Filipino American College Student Perspectives on Race and Meritocracy in Metropolitan New York." Emilie?
Hi, friends. I'm going to start my presentation now. Thanks so much, Emilie, for introducing me, and great job to all the other speakers so far. And of course, thanks so much to FANHS for making this event possible. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, can folks see this? Okay, great. So this is my presentation. It's based on some of my preliminary dissertation findings. So this is very new content that I'm very excited to share with you all today. This is just a quick overview of what I'll be going over, just the context, research questions. I'll be spending a lot of time on like some of these preliminary findings. And yeah, so how I came to this work, like my bio says, I'm originally from California. My background is in Asian American studies. So I'm very, I think about race a lot and all that, but coming to New York, there's just been it's been such a huge culture shock. And so through my research, I've been trying to like grapple with like, what are the experiences of Filipino Americans who grew up here, and like what makes us unique across coasts. And so one way I wanted to think about that was instead of thinking like, oh, like are Filipinos Asian or like whatever, I thought about it instead of like the model minority myth. Thank you. And so for those who aren't familiar, here's the definition that I have right here. I know it's like a wall of text, but I think one way to summarize it is that the model minority myth asserts that Asian Americans are successful, they're passive and studious as a result of their culture, and that they're basically like a threat to whites, or that they're like outwhiting whites, or they're honorary whites, etc. An easy way to think about it is, like literally the title of this article where I got this definition from, like, you're Asian, how could you fail math? Or also, especially right now in terms of COVID, it's like we're like a model minority until, until Asians are scapegoated for this pandemic. And yeah, and so that brings me to my, also, the way that Filipinos are racialized, it's very complicated. So as you can see here, they're shown to have one of the highest income levels and like actually one of the lowest poverty rates among Asian Americans. But at the same time, like where I'm from, and like in terms of like education research, Asian Filipinos are seen as like kind of like the opposite of like other ethnic groups, specifically East Asians, in terms of like educational attainment and things like that. And so, yeah, so that brings me to my research questions for my dissertation. I'm basically interested in like, what are the experiences of Filipino American college students in the New York Metropolitan area? So that includes Long Island, New York City, New York area, and Northern New Jersey. And again, I'm interested in how do they conceptualize their identities in terms of race and ethnicity. And specific to this presentation, I'm interested in like, how do they address narratives of meritocracy, such as the model minority myth? And so these are the methods that I use for my dissertation. I've done ethnographic fieldwork, at least before the pandemic started. And I've done qualitative interviews with 43 students. I never thought I'd ever do this many interviews in my life, but I did it. And this covers a variety of students who are either in D3 or not in D3. Also, some of my interviewees come from like universities that don't even have a Filipino organization. So yeah, and the interviews, they got a little long, so they range from 50 to 120 minutes. And yeah, and so for data analysis, I'm still in the process of transcribing interviews, but I've done a good chunk of them, and so that's what today's presentation is going to be on. I'm doing qualitative coding, or like looking for themes and like seeing how they all fit in together of these interviews transcripts, and I'm using this program called MaxQDA. And so these are just some examples of the themes if you could read them, but I'm going to go into a lot more detail about how these connect. And yeah, so these codes are more specific to like my questions on like the model minority myth. Yeah, and so some of my preliminary findings, honestly, the most surprising thing so far is that a lot of my interviewees actually weren't familiar with the model minority myth. So I ended up having to ask like, are you familiar with the model minority myth? And so, yeah, the fact that there's even like 40% of them, it speaks volumes. And even for those who did say yes, it seemed like there wasn't really like they were saying they knew what it was, but it was like more like they thought about, you know, stereotypes specific to Filipino Americans. So for instance, Joy here says, like these are the different like microaggressions she's heard from folks, like, oh, I love Filipinos, they're so nice. You know, my nurse is Filipino. And then, and so Joy says, we're kind of put on that standard that we're always friendly, we're always helpful. And that was, again, like her answer to like my question on like if the model minority myth applies to Filipinos. But overall, like once I defined what the model minority myth was for folks, I was also very surprised to find that most respondents felt that it did apply to Filipino Americans. So for those who did know the definition, it was more 50-50, but for those who were unfamiliar, definitely the majority said yes. And yes, interesting framing. So yeah, like people actually had different perceptions on what the model minority myth means. So while there's like the idea of like Filipino stereotypes, Alex thought about it. Oh, by the way, these are pseudonyms for the most part. These are talking, you know, Alex's experience, like they were really affected by the model minority myth in terms of like having that pressure to succeed. So yeah, so they mentioned that like the model minority myth was pertinent to my experiences. It sort of what pushed me to put so much pressure on myself academically. And then Sapphire also brought up, you know, how the model minority myth, like it is rooted in anti-Blackness, and therefore it applies to Filipinos and that we're very like guilty of this. And so Sapphire states, I think they definitely like perpetuate that. They try to be close to white people. That's what gives them more power. And also like Asians are so racist. Yeah. And then, and again, this is just an example of like some stereotypes that someone else mentioned. They had a much longer response, but this part stood out to me the most. So you're good at singing, you're good at dancing, you're probably good at cooking, you're so nice. And again, when thinking about like what is the model minority myth, when you think about what an Asian is, like these things don't really check out. So kind of like the definition that I shared earlier, the only real overlap that I saw was that, you know, Filipinos are good at science, and therefore, like Kim mentioned, like because they're good at science, they're gonna go into nursing. They're hardworking and nice, but again, like nice isn't quite the same as like being docile or quiet, definitely like not opportunistic. So yeah, so that was something that was really surprising for me. And then also, a lot of my interviewees brought up healthcare in their responses to this question. So for instance, one said that the model minority myth absolutely applies to Filipino Americans, especially with our history of migration, because there are these specific immigrants who come in as nurses and they fill a healthcare need in America. On the other hand, there were some folks who mentioned nursing, but because of Filipinos being nurses, they're not seen as a model minority. So for instance, Gabriella brought up that you know, Filipinos, they're healthcare workers or caretakers, or they work in nursing homes, like hospitality types of things. Like they're honest jobs, but they're not high powered positions. So it's really interesting to see that like contrast. And then again, like the model minority myth is also kind of like a cultural argument. So they argue that because of Asian cultural values, et cetera, they're seen as like high achieving. And so in the Filipino case, I was really surprised to see that folks apply this concept of utang na loob, or like an internalized debt. And so so as Connie says, I feel like especially first generation Filipino Americans, they get firsthand experience of what their parents went through, and they understand how hard it is for them to be where they are. And yeah, wait, hold on. I have so many quotes, but I think I'm almost done. Okay, and then so in talking more about this, I added a follow-up question. So do you think the model minority myth applies to Filipinos comparing to other Asian ethnic groups? In this case, this is when folks said it didn't apply to Filipinos comparing to, say, like East Asians. Like that was pretty much the main reason why it didn't apply. And especially for those who said in the beginning that the model minority myth didn't apply, it was because of like, well, we're not like East Asians. So for instance, I have this quote from Philip. This is like the inspiration for my title for this presentation. We're viewed as Asian, but we're not viewed as Asian, if that makes any sense. Like Asians are like honorary whites without, being white. And then another response I have is from Cookie. They state that East Asians and Southeast Asians are very different when it comes to racial issues. Like basically we're racialized differently. So they mentioned like we look like many races. We could be dark skinned, we could be light skinned, brown skinned. And again, this is in response to like my question on if the model minority myth applies. So I thought it was really interesting that like what does our racialization have to do with like success or like being high achieving and things like that. And so, yeah, with that said, these are my concluding thoughts. Basically, I think it's really important for us to listen to Filipino American New Yorkers. There's just like not enough research on Filipinos in New York. And then out of the research that does exist, it's mainly about like they're immigrants, they're nurses, etc. But these nurses, they brought families, and that's pretty much like the experiences of the folks that I've interviewed. Also, New York, it's super diverse, but ethnic studies is practically non-existent. Very few colleges have ethnic studies, and very few Filipino Americans in the New York area have access to it or are able to take classes in it, especially specific to the Filipino American experience. And so, yeah, and without ethnic studies, like, I feel like we don't have much of a chance to be able to critically talk about race and things like the model minority myth, which is very important, especially in this moment, because perpetuating the model minority myth, as we saw in like pretty much all these responses, whether they agreed with it or not, it helps perpetuate notions of anti-Blackness and xenophobia. And so yeah, so that's pretty much it. I have a couple more slides if I need to like explain anything else, but yeah, I'm open to any questions. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
All right, feel free to type your questions for Emilie. Put yourself off mute if you'd like. Emilie, we have a question. Are your findings presented as a New Yorker different from you being raised in California?
I think they are, because, I mean, just like the framing of my research is completely different. So for instance, like I did my, for my master's thesis, I did my research on Filipino American community college students. And the reason why I was doing that research was because this professor who's like a big name in Asian Americans and talking about education was like, oh, you should do your research on Filipino like college students to like, disprove the model minority myth. And so that in itself was like, that pretty much like one that's like problematic on so many levels. And so that's what my thesis was about, but also like, yeah, like Filipinos are not seen as like high achieving or as like successful. Whereas like in New York, like I felt like I was, people looked at me a certain way, even though I was like the only Asian American in the room most of the time as a PhD student. So people, okay, I'm losing my train of thought. Oh, but yeah, so I feel like in California, like, people are a lot more aware of the model minority myth, I guess. So I guess that's like a huge difference. And then whereas in like what I'm finding in the East Coast, like folks don't really have the chance to really talk about that. As I've seen in like certain like Filipino orgs, it's usually talking about like culture and, being social, and it's not necessarily like people don't really talk about education. Yeah, if that makes sense. Did you find any differences in responses between Filipino men and women? That's a very interesting question. I think for me, the biggest difference was in terms of like those who have access to ethnic studies. I think like the people that have taken, Asian American studies classes were like, no, it doesn't apply. Or yeah, so it's either in terms of like having taken ethnic studies classes, or I think it's also very tied to class. And so people that were like from Newark, for instance, no offense, but yeah, no, my interviews who are from Newark happened to say that like, no, it doesn't apply. Or like, you know, like they were in very segregated, they lived very segregated lives comparing to like other Asian Americans or other white people. And then also I think when I was first asking this question to folks, I think the people that had the hardest time like grappling with this were those who were actually like in STEM or like might be considered successful. So for instance, like, yeah, like I interviewed like students that were in engineering and they were like, what are you talking about? Like I worked hard or whatever. So it was really hard to like, there was like that cognitive dissonance. Filipinos in the South cannot relate to California and New York. Unfortunately, I only have one interviewee from the South. But yeah, I think that's very valid too. Like, you know, like Filipinos aren't just in California, they're also not just in New York. And so that's a very valid point as well. Like we need to diversify, you know, research.
There's a question before.
Oh, okay.
At the top, yeah.
Wait, can you read it? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. It says, great job, Emily. Whether or not students felt that the model minority myth was applicable, did they subscribe to the myth of meritocracy?
That's a very good question. I think, it's very valid. I feel like it depends, but I think overall in like what I'm seeing from like students in New York, I think that's very much more prevalent. Like for instance, like I've been involved in like Unipro, which is like all about, or at least Unipro New York is very much about like professional development. So that in itself was like a culture shock. You know, and the East Coast orgs, is including New York, are very much about like networking and like connecting with alumni. But and not so much being like very really critical about like our position in education, or like there isn't much talk about the idea that that Filipinos don't succeed or like not in college. Like that's just like, it doesn't seem to be something that's thought about from my experience. But then again, my research is on people that are in college, so it's like, I don't know, it's hard to tell. Any thoughts on promoting ethnic studies to be institutionalized as robust parts of the curriculum? I think there kind of is that call. I know in New York City, like there's been like workshops and stuff, like there are people that do want to bring in ethnic studies to the K through 12 classroom, at least. But it's very, it's, you know, not so much specific to Asian American studies or Filipino studies from what I've seen, to be honest. And then there's a lot of colleges, not a lot, but there are colleges in New York City, specifically public universities, that are actually like struggling to even keep ethnic studies or even have ethnic studies. Yeah, and then in NYU, like we have Asian Pacific American Studies, but we only have one graduate this year, Syra, shout out. And so, yeah. Sorry, there's so many questions. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. How do I do this?
I already unstopped.
You already stopped sharing.
Oh, I did, my bad, okay. Yes, very valid points. Jacksonville. Not ethnic studies. Can you talk more about ethnic studies? Looks like curriculum-wise, what is included in the curriculum? So ethnic studies is very, it's actually very interdisciplinary, and so that's something that I've like found based on like my own experiences. So for instance, at UCLA, Asian American studies is like in the social sciences, whereas like if you were to find other Asian American studies majors, even in like the East Coast, it's very like humanities specific. So like my school, like we had like Asian American like immigration, so like, you know, sociology kind of classes, education, history, and literature, whereas like I feel like East Coast, or like what I've seen, is a lot more like people studying Asian American literature, or for people that do have access to like kind of like a Filipino like studies education, it's usually through Filipino language classes or like Filipino history, things like that. And not so much like education. I don't think I've ever seen other folks studying education in New York. Cool, thanks for sharing. Suggestions on how to positively handle the model minority myth. That's an interesting question. I think, it's a good question. I think it's almost as complicated, or yeah, not almost, but I think it goes hand in hand with talking about like anti-Blackness and capitalism and things like that. Because the model minority myth was like, you know, rooted in anti-Blackness, like it was created as a response to Black power and the civil rights movement to separate Asian Americans from other people of color. So, so yeah, so there's that. And then, I don't know, let's talk about positive. But yeah, I feel like it's about like talking about, you know, the history of how Asian Americans have been racialized, which I don't know, I'm kind of negative, so I don't see that as a positive thing. But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Are there any questions that I missed?
I think that was all the questions.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yay, thank you.
Any of you were looking for someone specific or something just to get more connected with FANHS Metro New York chapter, I put our email there. There's also chapters across the country. So if you're coming from somewhere else, you can get connected with your chapter, but we're also going to be in a virtual world for a while, so feel free to get connected with us. We also have Instagram, and then very, very optional, but we are inviting, if anyone feels inclined and enjoyed today's program, wanted to donate, there's a link on our website, and it goes directly to us just being able to, when we are back in person, host events in person. Sometimes obviously there's like venues and food and things like that, so that's what donations, thank you, yes, multiple chapters. And I will pass it to Emilie, our event creator extraordinaire. I hope you're feeling all the warm feelings of how successful this was for our final word.
So I just want to iterate, and I want to thank everyone for your time. These past 2 hours, just going through 5 great speakers, and again, iterate the thank you to the speakers for preparing your talks, for sharing with us your stories, your research, and your work. Like it's been said, we don't want the conversation to end here. And so I hope you all have a takeaway from this, engage with other organizations or funds, and keep going with the message in this community space. We hope to see you in a different event. There's lots of links and in the chat, and then also we will have a follow-up email to you all. So thank you again for attending and for joining, and I hope you have a great evening.